Welcome to Story Planet. Take a deep breath, let go of the day, and settle into the quiet hush of winter. Tonight's story is The Lantern in the Snowstorm, a tale of whispers in the snow, forgotten footsteps, and a lantern that never stopped waiting. So pull up a warm blanket, listen to the fire crackle, and let the snowfall carry you away. Now, let's begin. The year was 1782, and the Highland winter had settled deep into the valley, wrapping the world in silence. Snow had fallen for days, swallowing the land beneath its thick, endless expanse of white. The sky, once a brilliant shade of silver in the daylight, had darkened, heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. The wind whispered over the hills, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and refused to leave. Through this desolate world, Margaret Sterling rode alone. Wrapped in a thick wool cloak, its hood drawn tightly around her face, she pressed forward through the snow-covered path, guiding her exhausted horse with gloved hands. The beast's breath clouded the air, nostrils flaring against the icy wind, its hooves sinking deep into the fresh snowfall. The carriage she had traveled in earlier had broken down miles behind her, its wheels trapped in the frozen ground. With the driver left behind to seek help, she had ventured forth alone, urged by the fading daylight and the knowledge that if she stopped, the cold would claim her. The wind howled through the barren trees, rattling the skeletal branches like ghostly fingers. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, the mountains looming in the distance like silent sentinels. She had heard the old stories of Jacobite soldiers who had vanished into these hills, of spirits that wandered the moors, of the lost travelers who followed the wrong path and were never seen again. She swallowed, gripping the reins tighter. She could not be one of them. The road, if it could even be called that, had long since disappeared beneath the snow. The world had become nothing more than an endless stretch of white, merging sky and ground into one. A single misstep, and she could lose her way completely. And then light. Flickering, small, and swaying in the distance. Margaret blinked against the swirling snow. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, a reflection of the storm's fury. But no, there it was again, steady, burning with purpose, fighting against the darkness. A lantern. Her heart quickened. No traveler would be out in weather such as this. Whoever held that light must belong to a home, a shelter, a place where the cold did not reach, a place she could rest. With newfound urgency, she urged her horse forward, toward the glow. The journey felt endless, each step slow and heavy as the snow clung to her skirts, weighing her down. Her limbs ached, and her breath came in shallow gasps, the cold creeping into her lungs like icy fingers. But she could not stop now. As she neared, the glow sharpened, revealing the shape of a small stone cottage nestled between the trees. Its roof was thick with snow, the windows lined with frost, but the chimney puffed out steady curls of smoke. The lantern, swaying from a wooden post, burned bright, casting a golden circle of warmth against the cold night. Margaret let out a shuddering breath. She had found refuge. Sliding off her horse, she staggered forward, her boots sinking into the snow as she reached the wooden door. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. Silence. For a moment she feared the worst. That the house was abandoned, that the light had been nothing more than a remnant of someone long gone. Then, the door creaked open. A man stood in the threshold, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark eyes scanning her with quiet caution. His thick woolen coat was dusted with snow, and a worn plaid draped over one shoulder, revealing his Highland roots. His face was sharp, rugged, and lined with the traces of a life hardened by the wilderness. Margaret barely found the strength to speak. "Please, I need shelter." The man studied her, the firelight from within casting flickering shadows over his face. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. She entered, and warmth wrapped around her like an embrace. The scent of burning peat and pine filled the air, and the fire in the hearth crackled, chasing away the chill from her bones. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, stacked with old books and dried herbs, and a sturdy wooden table sat in the center, worn from years of use. It was not a grand home, but it was safe. The door shut behind her, sealing out the storm. The man, her rescuer, watched her for a long moment before speaking. His voice was deep, steady, and tinged with the lilt of the highlands. "You should not have been out there alone." Margaret exhaled slowly, still trying to catch her breath. "I had no choice." He nodded, as if he understood. Then, without asking further, he moved toward the hearth and poured her a cup of warm broth, placing it before her on the wooden table. She hesitated before taking it, wrapping her fingers around the earthen mug. The heat seeped into her skin, grounding her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The man did not answer right away. Instead, he walked to the mantel, where the lantern she had followed sat. He ran his fingers along its brass surface, his expression unreadable. "The storm will not pass soon," he said, finally looking back at her. "You should rest. You will not be leaving tonight." Margaret nodded, exhaustion weighing her limbs. She knew he was right. She had been lost in the snow, and the lantern had led her here. And as she sat by the fire, sipping the broth that warmed her from the inside, she could not shake the feeling that she had not merely stumbled upon this place by chance. The lantern had guided her. And somehow, she knew, it had been waiting for her all along. The warmth of the fire seeped into Margaret's bones, chasing away the numbing cold that had wrapped around her like a second skin. She sat in silence, her fingers curled around the earthen mug, the scent of hot broth filling her senses. She had not realized how weak she felt until now, as the exhaustion settled upon her shoulders like a heavy woolen cloak. The man across the room moved with quiet efficiency, his boots firm against the wooden floor. He reached for a kettle that sat near the hearth, pouring hot water into a small pot of dried herbs. The scent of heather and thyme drifted into the air, mixing with the smoke from the peat fire. Margaret watched him, her mind still sluggish from the cold, her voice hesitant as she finally spoke. "You live here alone?" Her words came soft, almost uncertain. The man glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Aye." His voice was deep, steady, laced with the accent of the highlands. "No one comes this far into the hills unless they must." Margaret nodded, her fingers tightening around the warm mug. "Then I suppose I am fortunate that you do." He did not answer right away. Instead, he lifted the pot and poured the fragrant tea into a small wooden cup, placing it beside her. "Drink this. It will help warm you." Margaret hesitated only for a moment before lifting the cup to her lips. The tea was strong, earthy, the heat spreading through her like a quiet ember. She exhaled, feeling the last of the storm's cold retreat from her limbs. The wind outside howled, rattling the wooden shutters. Snow continued to fall in thick drifts, its presence an unrelenting force against the cottage. Margaret knew she would not be leaving soon. The realization did not bring the unease she expected. "What is your name?" she asked, looking at him over the rim of her cup. For a moment he was silent, as though measuring whether to give her an answer. Then, at last, he spoke. "Ewan Fraser." The name was familiar, too familiar. Margaret frowned slightly. "Fraser?" He looked at her then, his gaze sharp. "You know the name?" "Aye," she admitted, setting her tea down. "My father, he spoke of the Frasers once." A shadow flickered over Ewan's face, a ghost of something unspoken. He leaned back against the heavy wooden table, arms crossing over his chest. "If your father spoke of my kin, then I doubt it was kindly." Margaret hesitated. "He fought for the crown." Ewan exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Then we stood on different sides of the war." Silence stretched between them, the fire crackling in the hearth, the only sound in the room. The echoes of the past lingered between them like a heavy mist, an invisible chasm neither of them had expected to stand upon. Margaret swallowed. "The war is over." Ewan's gaze did not waver. "For some, perhaps." She understood what he meant. The Highlands still bore the scars of Culloden, even now, years after the battle had been lost. The land had changed, the clans scattered, the way of life her ancestors had known slipping further into memory with each passing winter. Margaret lowered her gaze, staring into the fire. She had been a child when the Jacobites had fallen, too young to understand the full weight of what had been lost. But she had grown up hearing the stories of men who had vanished into the mountains, of homes burned, of names whispered in fear. And now she sat before one of them. The wind outside pressed against the cottage, a reminder that she had nowhere else to go. Slowly, she looked back at him. "I do not seek trouble." Ewan studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then you'll find none here." A breath she hadn't realized she was holding slipped from her lips. He turned away, lifting a heavy woolen blanket from a wooden chair and offering it to her. "You should rest. The storm will not pass before morning." Margaret hesitated, but exhaustion was winning against caution. She reached for the blanket, the fabric thick and heavy between her fingers. "Thank you." Ewan only nodded before stepping toward the door, peering through the small frosted window as if watching for something unseen. The lantern still burned outside, its light steady in the darkness. Margaret curled up on the wooden bench by the fire, the warmth of the blanket cocooning her as she let her head rest against the armrest. Her body ached, her mind hazy with the weight of the day's journey. As sleep began to pull her under, she heard Ewan's voice, quiet and distant, almost to himself. "The lantern has not burned this bright in years." Margaret barely had the strength to wonder what he meant before the sound of the wind faded, and she drifted into sleep, the firelight dancing against the walls. The storm raged outside, but within the stone walls of the Highland refuge, Margaret Sterling finally found rest. Margaret awoke to the soft crackling of the fire, the warmth of the woolen blanket still wrapped around her. For a moment she remained still, her breath slow, her mind caught between the haze of dreams and the quiet hush of the morning. Outside, the wind had settled to a whisper, and a pale light seeped through the small window, casting soft shadows along the wooden beams of the cottage. The storm had passed. She sat up slowly, pushing back the heavy blanket. Her muscles ached from the previous day's journey, her body still weary, but the sharp cold that had clung to her bones was gone. The fire had done its work, and so had the tea and broth Ewan had given her. "Ewan." Her eyes drifted across the room, where he stood near the door, fastening his thick woolen cloak over his broad shoulders. His movements were steady, practiced, as though this morning was like any other. As if sheltering a stranger in the middle of a snowstorm was nothing out of the ordinary. Margaret cleared her throat, drawing his attention. "The storm has passed?" He glanced toward the window before giving a small nod. "Aye, but the snow is deep. You'll not be going far today." Margaret exhaled, both relieved and wary. She had no immediate desire to face the cold again, but she was not certain how long she could remain in this cottage. She was an outsider, and though Ewan had been hospitable, his quiet nature left her uncertain of how welcome she truly was. "You should eat," he said, moving toward the hearth. "There is oat porridge and some bread." Margaret hesitated before swinging her legs over the bench and rising to her feet. The floor was cold against her stockings, but the air inside the cottage was warm, the scent of wood smoke and something faintly herbal clinging to the room. She moved toward the wooden table where a simple meal awaited. A bowl of thick porridge, a slab of fresh bread, and a small pot of honey. She sat, lifting the wooden spoon, the heat from the food curling around her fingers. "Thank you," she murmured. Ewan only nodded, moving to the door. "I'll be outside. There's work to do." Margaret watched as he pulled open the door, a gust of cold slipping inside before he stepped out and closed it behind him. She ate slowly, her mind drifting, her ears attuned to the quiet sounds of the morning, the crackle of fire, the distant caw of a bird, the faint creak of wood as the cottage settled. After finishing her meal, she stood and moved to the small window, wiping away a thin layer of frost to peer outside. The world was pristine and white, untouched, save for a single set of footprints leading away from the cottage. The snow, deep and unbroken beyond Ewan's path, shimmered beneath the pale light of the sky. The trees, their branches heavy with ice, stood silent as sentinels, their dark forms rising against the whiteness. Something about it all felt otherworldly, as though she had woken in a dream. She pulled her cloak over her shoulders before stepping toward the door. The cold met her instantly, crisp and sharp against her skin, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It was clean, fresh, a reminder that the storm had passed and the world had been made new. Ewan stood a short distance away, clearing snow from a wooden path that led toward what looked to be a small barn. The rhythmic scrape of his shovel broke the stillness of the morning. Margaret hesitated before following the footprints toward him. "May I help?" Ewan paused, glancing at her. "You don't strike me as someone accustomed to clearing snow." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps not, but I can learn." For a moment, he simply watched her, as though weighing her words. Then with a slight nod, he handed her a second shovel, the wooden handles smooth beneath her fingers. "Start near the door," he said. "The snow is lighter there." Margaret nodded and began mimicking his movements, though hers were far less efficient. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the effort kept her warm, and for the first time since arriving, she felt something settle within her. A sense of purpose, however small. They worked in silence, clearing the path slowly. The rhythm was almost meditative, the steady scrape of the shovel against the stone path, the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots. The stillness of the highlands stretched around them, the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks veiled in mist. After a while, Margaret straightened, breathing deeply, watching as her breath curled into the air. "You said no one comes this far into the hills unless they must," she said, glancing at Ewan. "Why do you stay?" Ewan leaned on his shovel, studying the land before them. "It was my father's land," he said simply, "and his father's before him. When the war ended, when the soldiers came to burn the crofts, this place was spared, perhaps because no one thought it worth the trouble." He exhaled, his gaze distant. "I stayed because it is the last piece of what once was." Margaret felt a quiet weight in his words, something she did not yet fully understand. "You said the lantern had not burned this bright in years." Ewan nodded slowly. "Aye. The lantern has always been here. It belonged to my great-grandfather, and before him to his father. They say it is a light for the lost, a guide for those who wander too far from home." Margaret looked back toward the cottage where the lantern still hung from its wooden post, its glass now free of frost. "It led me here." Ewan's gaze flickered toward her, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Perhaps it was always meant to." The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of pine and the distant hint of something familiar, as if the past had not yet finished whispering its secrets. And for the first time, Margaret wondered if she had not merely stumbled upon this place, but had been called to it. The afternoon light had softened, casting a silver glow over the highlands. The wind had died down, leaving only the hush of snowfall that drifted gently from the sky. Margaret stood just outside the cottage, watching the lantern sway lightly from its post. The snow had settled around it in soft mounds, undisturbed except for the path she and Ewan had cleared earlier. The footprints they had left behind were already fading beneath a new dusting of white. She pulled her cloak tightly around her shoulders, feeling the cold settle into her bones, though it was not unpleasant. The quiet of the land around her was almost comforting. The mountains stood like great sentinels in the distance, their peaks veiled in mist, and beyond the tree line, The dark forest waited, silent and still. Ewan had gone to check the traps he had set before the storm, leaving her alone for the first time since she arrived. She had taken his absence as an opportunity to explore, though she did so with a careful hesitance, not wanting to wander too far. She walked along the edge of the path, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. The air smelled crisp and clean, with the faintest hint of pine carried on the breeze. The trees ahead stood like tall, dark pillars, their branches heavy with snow. Margaret took a step forward, then another, drawn toward the forest without quite knowing why. The moment she stepped beneath the trees, the world shifted. The sounds of the wind and the open land behind her faded, replaced by a deep, enveloping silence. The air here was different, cooler, filled with the scent of damp earth beneath the frozen layer of snow. She walked slowly, her fingers grazing the rough bark of a tree as she passed. Then she saw them, footprints. Not hers, not Ewan's. Margaret stopped, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. The prints were deep, leading further into the forest, half covered by fresh snowfall but still visible enough to follow. She swallowed, her breath curling in the cold air. Who else would be out here? She hesitated only for a moment before following them. Her steps were careful, her mind alert. The further she went, the quieter the world became, as though the trees themselves were listening. The footprints led her deeper into the woods, winding between tall trunks and over uneven ground. Then, abruptly, they stopped. Margaret frowned, glancing around. There was no sign of a struggle, no disturbance in the snow beyond the prints themselves. It was as if whoever had walked this path had simply vanished. A chill, separate from the cold, ran down her spine. She turned, ready to head back, but something caught her eye, a glint of metal half buried in the snow. Margaret knelt, brushing away the frost with gloved fingers. Her breath caught as she lifted the object into her palm. It was a brooch, its silver tarnished with age, the shape unmistakable. A thistle, wrapped in delicate etchings. A Jacobite emblem. Her pulse quickened. She had seen one just like this before, years ago, tucked inside a wooden chest in her father's study. He had told her it belonged to a man who had died at Culloden, a relative whose name had been lost to time. What was it doing here? She stood quickly, glancing around, suddenly feeling as though she were being watched. But there was nothing. Just trees. Just silence. Margaret turned and retraced her steps, moving faster now. The forest no longer felt quiet. It felt expectant, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the edges of her vision. She reached the cottage within minutes, her breath coming faster than before. Ewan had returned, standing near the door, watching her approach. His expression darkened when he saw her face. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated before extending her hand, the brooch resting in her palm. Ewan's gaze dropped to it, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from her fingers. His grip tightened. "Where did you find this?" "In the forest," she answered, still catching her breath. There were footprints. But they ended suddenly. There was nothing there. Ewan exhaled sharply, his jaw tense. This belonged to a man who should not have been forgotten. Margaret swallowed. "Who?" He met her gaze, the flickering lantern light reflecting in his dark eyes. "My uncle, Rory Fraser. He fought for the Jacobites. He never came home." Margaret's fingers curled around the edge of her cloak. "Then how did his brooch end up in the snow?" Ewan did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the forest, his expression unreadable. Perhaps the past is not as buried as we think. The wind stirred then, rattling the trees, sending a flurry of snow down from the branches. The lantern burned steadily, casting its glow against the stone walls of the cottage. Margaret exhaled, her mind whirling with questions she did not yet know how to ask. The forest had given them something tonight, a whisper of the past, a footprint of a man long gone. And Margaret had the strange feeling that whatever had called her there was not yet finished speaking. The wind carried the hush of winter through the valley, stirring the branches of the ancient trees that stood like watchful sentinels around the cottage. The sky had begun its slow descent into twilight, painting the world in soft hues of blue and silver. Inside, Margaret stood by the hearth, staring down at the Jacobite brooch that now lay upon the wooden table. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light across its tarnished silver, the thistle emblem gleaming despite years lost beneath the snow. It was as if the past had surfaced, unburied by time, placed directly into her hands. Ewan sat in the chair across from her, his gaze dark and contemplative. He had said little since she had handed him the brooch, but his fingers, curled loosely around a cup of warm tea, were tense, his knuckles white. At last he spoke. Rory Fraser vanished during the retreat after Culloden. The last word of him came from a rider who claimed to have seen him fleeing into the hills, wounded but alive. That was nearly 40 years ago. His voice was steady, but there was something in it, something distant, as though he had long since learned not to hope for answers. He was my father's elder brother, a warrior of the old ways, a man who never bent the knee. Margaret swallowed. And yet his brooch was there, in the forest, beneath fresh snow, as if left for us to find. Ewan's gaze flickered to her, unreadable. You believe someone placed it there? She hesitated. I don't know, but footprints led to the place where I found it. Then they ended. Silence settled between them, heavy as the snowfall beyond the window. This place holds memories, Ewan murmured. Old ones, and some refuse to be forgotten. Margaret shivered. It was not fear that touched her, but something else, something she could not name, a sense of threads weaving together, of voices calling from across time. She had never believed in ghosts, not truly, but the weight of the brooch in her palm made her wonder. Ewan exhaled, pushing himself to his feet. I will stoke the fire in the barn. The snow will be thick tonight. Margaret watched as he shrugged into his thick wool cloak and pulled open the door. A rush of cold air slipped inside, curling around her ankles before vanishing into the shadows. The door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the golden glow of the hearth. Her fingers brushed the edge of the brooch, tracing the familiar lines of the thistle. And then, on impulse, she picked it up and closed her fingers around it. The moment she did, the world shifted. A whisper, soft, distant, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Margaret turned sharply, but the cottage was empty. The only movement, the slow flicker of the firelight against the stone walls. The sound had been faint, almost imperceptible. A trick of her mind, surely. Surely. She exhaled, releasing the brooch, letting it fall back onto the wooden surface of the table. The whisper stopped. Her heart pounded, though she could not explain why. It was foolishness. The storm had rattled her nerves, that was all. Shaking her head, she turned away, rubbing her hands along the sleeves of her dress, as if to rid herself of the strange sensation. The kettle by the hearth still held warm water, so she poured herself a cup, willing herself to be still. Then, just as she lifted it to her lips, the whisper came again. Not outside, not from the wind, inside the cottage. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping the dimly lit room, searching for something. Someone. But she was alone. The whisper was not a voice. It was something softer, thinner than air. A thread of sound, stretching from somewhere unseen, barely there at all. And yet it sent a chill down her spine. She stepped back toward the table, her eyes fixed on the brooch. The whisper faded. Margaret swallowed. Then, hesitantly, she reached out and touched it once more. The room darkened. Not completely, not as if a candle had been snuffed out, but the light in the room seemed to shift, as if shadows had deepened, as if the fire's glow had pulled away from the edges of the space. And then faintly, so faintly she almost didn't hear it, there was the sound of movement. Margaret's breath came shallow. The sound was behind her. She turned swiftly, her heart hammering in her chest. Nothing. The door remained closed. The window panes were misted with frost. The fire burned steadily, as it had before, but she was no longer certain she was alone. The past, it seemed, was still very much present, and Margaret Sterling had the strange, unmistakable feeling that something or someone was trying to be heard. Outside, the lantern swayed gently from its post, its golden glow burning against the darkness, and deep in the forest, beneath the weight of centuries, footsteps stirred the snow once more. The wind had quieted, leaving only the rhythmic creak of tree branches swaying under the weight of fresh snow. A hush had settled over the land, as though the highlands themselves were holding their breath. Inside the cottage, the glow of the fire danced upon the stone walls, but Margaret no longer felt the warmth of the flames. She remained still, listening, every fiber of her being alert. The whisper had faded, yet something lingered. A presence she could not name, a feeling that crawled along her skin like the memory of a touch long past. She turned toward the door. Beyond it, the lantern swayed from its post, its flame burning steadily despite the lack of wind. The golden light flickered against the frost-laced window, casting ghostly shadows along the wooden floorboards. Margaret stepped forward. The moment her fingers curled around the edge of the door, the whisper returned. A breath. A hush, a sigh carried through time. Her pulse quickened, but she did not pull away. Slowly she pushed the door open. The night met her in a soft embrace. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, shimmering like stars before settling upon the untouched ground. The lantern glowed in the darkness, casting its light in a wide, golden circle around the cottage. Beyond the glow, the forest loomed, silent, watching. Margaret stepped outside. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed upon the snow beyond the lantern's reach. Footprints, not the ones she and Ewan had left earlier that day. These were fresh. Leading from the edge of the trees, they stopped just short of the lantern's light, as if whoever had walked there had hesitated, unwilling or unable to step forward. Margaret's breath curled in the frigid air. Slowly she moved toward the edge of the light, her boots crunching softly against the snow. She stopped just before the footprints, peering into the darkness of the trees. "Who's there?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. She was not certain she wanted an answer. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the night, the faint rustling of branches. Then, a shift, a shadow among the trees. Margaret's breath caught. The figure stood motionless, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. She could not see a face, only the vague outline of a man, broad-shouldered, tall, watching, waiting. Her fingers curled into her cloak. "Ewan?" she called softly, though she already knew it was not him. Ewan had gone to the barn. The figure did not move. Margaret took a step forward, but the instant she did, the lantern's glow flickered. The wind stirred, sharp and sudden, sending a spray of snow across the footprints. And then, the figure was gone. Margaret gasped, her heart thudding in her chest. She blinked against the swirling snow, searching the darkness. Nothing. Only the trees, still and unmoved, the footprints already fading beneath the fresh snowfall. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest. Then the door behind her creaked open. "Margaret?" She turned sharply, her breath still shallow. Ewan stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed. Snow dusted his shoulders, his cloak still damp from the cold. "What are you doing out here?" Margaret hesitated before glancing back toward the trees. The footprints were nearly gone now, as though they had never been there at all. She swallowed, then met his gaze. There was someone here. Ewan's expression darkened. "Where?" Margaret pointed toward the fading footprints. "Standing at the tree line, watching. But when I stepped forward, he disappeared." Ewan stepped past her, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was quiet for a long moment, as if listening for something beyond what could be seen. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, thoughtful. "You saw him then?" Margaret's pulse quickened. "You've seen him before?" Ewan exhaled, his breath curling into the cold night air. Not me, but my father did, and my grandfather before him. He glanced at her. The man in the trees, the one who does not cross the lantern's light. A shiver ran down Margaret's spine. Who is he? Ewan's gaze drifted back toward the forest, his jaw tight. A man who never made it home. Silence stretched between them. Margaret's mind raced, piecing together fragments of stories, whispers of the past. She thought of the brooch, of the whispers in the cottage, of Rory Fraser who had vanished all those years ago. You think it's him, she whispered. Ewan did not answer right away. The firelight from the cottage flickered behind him, casting his face in shadow. I think, he said finally, that some men leave footprints long after they are gone. Margaret shuddered. For the first time, she wondered if she had truly come here by chance, or if she had been led. She turned back toward the forest, but the trees remained still, their secrets buried beneath the weight of the snow, and in the lantern's golden glow, the past waited. The morning arrived in silence, draping the land in soft blue light. Snow blanketed the hills like an untouched quilt, its surface shimmering beneath the first fragile rays of dawn. The air carried the scent of ice and pine, crisp and untouched, as though the world itself had paused to listen. Inside the cottage, warmth clung to the stone walls, yet Margaret felt a lingering chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. She lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above her, her mind tethered to the lingering image of the shadowed figure among the trees. Sleep had been restless, her thoughts circling the footprints that had vanished, the presence that had been there, then was gone. Ewan had gone to bed after a long, thoughtful silence. He had not dismissed what she had seen, nor had he spoken of it further. But Margaret could tell by the way his brow creased, by the way he stood at the window long after she had closed the door, that the past was stirring within him. And she knew he felt it too. She rose, wrapping herself in her cloak, and moved toward the door. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its embers casting faint flickers of warmth. The air inside the cottage was cold, but it was nothing compared to the frost that waited outside. She hesitated only for a moment before pushing the door open. The wind met her with a sharp bite, curling around her like unseen hands. The sky had begun its slow transformation from indigo to pale silver. The world caught in the quiet hush before the sun truly rose. Her boots crunched against the fresh snow as she stepped forward, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She made her way toward the lantern, its flame still flickering weakly in the morning breeze. And just beyond its glow, where the footprints had been the night before, the snow had settled again, smooth, undisturbed. Except for one thing. Margaret's breath hitched. There, etched into the surface of the snow as if written by an unseen hand, was a name. Rory. She staggered back, her pulse a wild drumbeat in her chest. The letters were shallow, fragile, as though the wind could erase them at any moment. But they were there. Clear as the sky above, a shiver crept along her spine. Ewan! The door behind her groaned open, and she heard the heavy sound of boots crunching toward her. What is it? His voice was thick with sleep, but when he saw the name in the snow, he stilled. Margaret turned to him, her breath shallow. You see it? Ewan did not answer at first. His eyes were fixed on the name, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice rough with something she could not quite name, he whispered, I. They stood there, side by side, as the morning light deepened, turning the snow to silver. The name did not fade, nor did the wind claim it. Margaret's heart pounded. The snow had been smooth last night. She had seen it herself before stepping inside. There had been no marks, no disturbances. Someone came, she murmured. Someone wrote this. Ewan exhaled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Or someone never left. The weight of his words pressed against the air between them. Margaret shivered, but not from the cold. What if Rory was still here? Not as flesh and blood, but as something else, something lingering, waiting. A gust of wind stirred the trees, shaking loose a flurry of frost-laden branches. The sound was hollow, distant, like a sigh slipping through the valley. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. What happened to him? Rory? Ewan did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the name in the snow, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned and walked toward the cottage, motioning for her to follow. Inside, the fire had dimmed to embers. He crouched beside it, stoking the flames back to life, sending shadows dancing along the stone walls. Margaret stood near the table, waiting. She knew he would tell her, but only when he was ready. At last, Ewan spoke. Rory fought at Culloden. He did not die there, but he might as well have. His voice was quiet, rough like gravel beneath the weight of time. The English hunted them down, the ones who lived. The Highlands became a place of silence, a place where no man spoke his true name. My father was a boy when Rory fled. He remembers his mother waiting by the window for him to return. She never left that chair, not truly. She died still waiting. Margaret swallowed, her fingers tightening over the back of the wooden chair beside her. And you think he never made it home? Ewan nodded once. That's what the stories say. That he was lost in the hills, wounded. That he vanished into the snow. His voice lowered. Some say he was buried in it. Margaret's chest tightened. Then who wrote his name? Ewan met her gaze, something dark and knowing flickering behind his eyes. That, lass, is what we must find out. The wind rattled the window, sending a gust of frost against the glass. The fire burned brighter now, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep within Margaret's bones. She had felt it since she arrived, the weight of something unfinished, something restless, and now she knew. She had not come here by chance. She had come because the past had been waiting, and the past was ready to speak. The snow had settled like a hush over the land, its weight pressing upon the world in a way that Margaret could feel in her very bones. The morning had passed in uneasy silence, each moment stretching longer than the last. The name in the snow was gone now, lost beneath a fresh dusting of white, but neither she nor Ewan spoke of it. It was as though saying it aloud would give it more power, would bind them more closely to the presence that had left its mark behind. Margaret sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, but the warmth did little to ease the cold that had settled within her. Her mind churned with thoughts, circling around the same question. What had Rory Fraser left unfinished? Ewan stood by the door, his arms crossed over his broad chest, staring out at the trees beyond the lantern's glow. His jaw was tight, his thoughts clearly as troubled as hers. Finally, he turned to her. We need to search the forest. Margaret set her cup down, meeting his gaze. You think we'll find something? Ewan's brow furrowed. I think something wants to be found. The wind howled low as they stepped outside, their boots sinking into the thick drifts of snow. The forest stood before them, dark and still, a wall of frost-tipped branches that swayed ever so slightly in the wind's breath. The trees were ancient, their roots winding deep beneath the frozen ground, their limbs stretching high toward the pale sky. Margaret followed close behind Ewan, the cold creeping into her bones despite the thick wool of her cloak. The further they ventured, the more the silence seemed to settle around them. Not a peaceful silence, but one that waited, one that listened. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Ewan stopped. There, he murmured, pointing to a spot where the snow had been disturbed. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but there, a pattern in the frost, as though someone had walked through, yet left no true footprints behind. Margaret swallowed. We're not alone out here, are we? Ewan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the ice, his gaze scanning the trees. Then, suddenly, he knelt. Something's buried here. Margaret's breath caught. What is it? Ewan ran his hand over the snow, brushing it aside to reveal something beneath. A small wooden box, its edges darkened with age, its surface carved with the faint remnants of an old crest. A thistle. Margaret's heart pounded. The same symbol as the brooch. Ewan lifted the box carefully, brushing away the last of the snow. It was light, the wood fragile, worn by time. With a slow breath, he opened the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters, bound with a faded ribbon, their parchment yellowed with age. Margaret reached forward, tracing the edge of the topmost page with careful fingers. The ink had faded, but the words were still visible, and at the bottom, in a hand that trembled but remained clear, was the signature, Rory Fraser. Her breath caught. These were his. Ewan exhaled sharply, his grip on the box tightening. Then maybe now we'll know why he never came home. The wind stirred again, sending a whisper through the trees. Margaret shivered. It almost sounded like relief. The fire flickered low in the hearth, casting long shadows against the stone walls. Margaret and Ewan sat at the wooden table, the small, time-worn box between them. The aged letters inside trembled slightly in Margaret's hands as she lifted the first one, its edges delicate, its ink faded but still legible in the lantern's glow. She hesitated, glancing at Ewan. His gaze remained fixed on the paper, his jaw set, his hands curled into fists on the table. Margaret could see the weight of it pressing against him, the burden of a name never forgotten, of a family's unanswered grief. With a slow, steady breath, she unfolded the first letter and began to read aloud. March 1746. The snow falls thick in the valley tonight. I know they will come soon. They will not stop until they have hunted us all to the ground. The others say we should keep moving, but I am tired. Tired of running, tired of the silence. I think often of home, of the warm light in the window, of my mother's hands as she braided my sister's hair, of my brother who stood beside me on the moors and the promises we made. Will I ever see them again? I do not know. But if these words find them, let them know I tried. I tried. Margaret's throat tightened. She lifted her gaze to Ewan, whose face remained unreadable, though something in his expression had shifted, as though a crack had formed in the stone of his composure. She reached for the next letter, carefully unfolding it. April 1746. I have not slept in days. The ground is too cold, the wind too loud. I dream, but the dreams are cruel. I wake with my hands clutching the snow, thinking it is a blade. They took Alistair yesterday. We heard his cries, but we could not help him. We were cowards, hiding in the dark while they dragged him away. I do not know if he lives, but I know he will not speak my name. He is braver than I ever was. The cottage was silent, except for the sound of the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The letters trembled in Margaret's hands, the weight of history pressing against her. Rory had written these words as he hid in the frozen wilderness, knowing he might never return home. She unfolded another letter, its parchment softer, more worn than the others. May 1746. There is a place in the woods where the ground is soft, where the roots of the old oak reach deep into the earth. I buried something there today. Not gold, nor weapons, but the only thing I had left of home. A token, a promise. If I do not return, let it remain, a part of me left behind. Margaret's pulse quickened. Ewan, he buried something. Ewan's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. The old oak, there's only one that fits that description. It stands beyond the ridge, near the river's bend. Margaret nodded. Then we have to go there. Ewan exhaled, his gaze drifting to the letters. Aye, he murmured. We do. The wind stirred against the cottage, rattling the shutters. The fire in the hearth flared briefly, as though the very air had shifted. Margaret felt it deep in her chest, a pull, a whisper of something waiting just beyond the trees. Rory had left his words behind, but he had left something else, too. Something that had waited for decades beneath the snow, beneath the roots of the old oak. And now, at last, it was time to find it. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh snow, the kind that settled in thick layers over the earth and muffled all sound. Margaret and Ewan moved through the forest in silence, their breaths curling into the cold morning air. The trees stood tall around them, their limbs burdened with ice, the weight of winter pressing upon them like an unspoken truth. Ewan led the way, his steps firm and sure, though Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the unspoken weight of the past lingering in his movements. The letters had stirred something in him, something that had long been buried like the very secret they sought. The path to the old oak was not long, but the journey felt heavy, as though the past itself was pressing against them with each step they took. Margaret glanced at Ewan as they walked, his jaw set, his breath steady. "How long has it been since someone came here?" she asked softly, her voice nearly lost beneath the hush of snowfall. Ewan exhaled. "My father never spoke of this place, but my grandfather, he used to tell stories of a tree that held secrets, of something left behind." He paused. "I never thought much of it until now." Margaret nodded, gripping the edges of her cloak. The wind stirred through the trees, and ahead, beyond the frost-laden branches, the oak came into view. It stood apart from the others, its trunk thick with age, its roots sprawling beneath the snow like the fingers of something ancient, something watching. The sight of it sent a shiver through Margaret, though not from the cold. Ewan stopped beside the tree, his gaze sweeping over the ground. "He said he buried something here." Margaret nodded. "Then we find it." They worked in silence, brushing away the snow, clearing the frozen earth beneath the wide roots of the tree. The soil was hard, unwilling to yield, but Ewan pressed on, his hands strong, his determination unwavering. Then, a dull thud beneath the dirt. Margaret inhaled sharply. Ewan stilled, his fingers brushing against something solid. Carefully, he cleared more earth away, revealing the edge of an old wooden box, weathered, its surface darkened by time. Ewan's breath came slow and steady as he lifted it from the ground. The box was small, no larger than a man's hands, its lid carved with a faded emblem. The Fraser crest. Margaret swallowed. "This is it." Ewan nodded but said nothing. Instead, he carefully pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay a silver pendant, a small, round locket, its surface etched with intricate patterns. Beside it, a folded parchment, its edges fragile with age. Margaret reached for the parchment, unfolding it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words remained. "For my mother. For my brother. If I do not return, let them know I never forgot. Let them know I tried." The signature beneath it was unmistakable. Rory Fraser. Ewan closed his eyes, exhaling. The tension in his shoulders did not lessen, but something about him softened, something unspoken settling into place. Margaret ran her fingers over the locket, feeling its cool surface beneath her skin. "It's been waiting all this time," Ewan nodded, "and now at last it's home." The wind stirred again, lifting a fine dusting of snow from the ground. Margaret could almost hear it, the whisper of something shifting, something settling. For the first time, she felt that Rory Fraser had finally found his way home. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If you felt the snowfall around you, if you walked the frozen path, if the lantern's glow lingered in your mind, consider giving a thumbs up. And if this story brought you peace and quiet wonder, share it with those who might need a moment of stillness. Don't forget to subscribe for more gentle, soothing tales to drift into night after night. Wishing you warmth and peaceful dreams.